equitable and responsive school culture. And so that's what we're going to talk about. Our three big chunks today is going to really be about equity, um, cultural responsiveness, and cultural humility. Like I said, all three of those are probably like three different presentations, but I only have like one more day right now with you all, so I'm trying to get as much as possible, giving you your money's worth. So we'll take as much as we can handle. So as I said, we're going to talk about ensuring equity in the classroom, common language, cultural responsiveness, cultural humility, and cultural competence, and then cultural responsive teaching. And my focus is probably going to be on the first and third pieces of that work. So, I'm going to do open mic because I love to get you all's opinions and thoughts. We know in the classroom, it's about voice and choice, right, for students. If the teacher's the only person talking in the classroom, it's probably problematic. There's not a lot of learning going on. So we want to hear from you all. And so I want to hear from this is like, when you hear educational equity, what pops in your head? When you hear the phrase educational equity, what pops in your head?
Equal opportunities.
Okay, equal opportunities. You can either put in the chat or you can unmute and tell me.
Equal playing field.
Equal playing field. Okay. Anyone else?
Actually, it's a visual. The visual pops in my head as kids looking at the field, equity versus or equal versus equity of what the difference is.
Yeah, looking over the fence, right?
Yep.
Yep.
That's what pops into my head.
Mine too.
Okay. And what we want to do is go beyond that and knock the fence down, correct? Remove barriers. So no one has to sit on the box, or you don't need 2 boxes or 3 boxes. But if you remove the barriers for everyone, we're doing that. So I want to get into equity first. And, I did a lot of facilitation. I don't really like the word training for a lot of school districts around the country. And I never tell anyone how to teach, and I never tell anyone how to lead a building. But I will hang my hat on 2 things that I think is critical for students to be successful. That we had to have equitable practices and programs and equitable policies. And we also had to have an environment that's conducive for learning. The culture of the school is critical. And so you can do everything else, but if those things are not in place, good luck on everything else. So let's talk about equity for a second. There's a number of different definitions around educational equity. I'm using this one. Educational equity is the provision of personalized resources, instruction, academic support needed for all individuals to reach common goals. In other words, the goals and expectations are the same for all students, but the supports needed to achieve those goals depends on the student's needs. So we know one thing, that equity is not equal. It all tends to really personalized for those students. And even when you look at a school, that if you take, I used to be over federal programs for the State Department of Kentucky, and I had federal programs under me in Title.1. Even when we give out Title.1 money to schools, it's not the same amount of money, right? It's based on need. Mm-hmm. And so you can even look at Title.1 as an equity issue. Title.9 is an equity issue for sports and things like that. And gender equity is an equity issue. So it's not always just about the students, but also providing equitable resources and things like that for individual schools and districts and things of that nature. Now, how many of you all, you can use your hand, the little hand thing on Zoom, or you can raise your hand however you want to. How many of you are familiar with the term equity literacy? Okay, I see Lisa, China. Okay, so let's explore those 2 concepts, equity literacy and equity literate educators.
Salad, I forgot salad.
Equity literacy is comprised of the skills and dispositions that enable educators to recognize, respond to, and redress the conditions that deny some students access to the educational opportunities enjoyed by their peers. Equity literacy is comprised of the skills and dispositions that enable educators to recognize, respond to, and redress conditions. So first thing we have to do is be able to, as a staff or faculty or in your office that you're organization or the State Department is to be able to, one, recognize the inequities that may be taking place in schools. And then you have to be able to respond to those inequities in order to change or eradicate the situations or conditions where we find our students. So equity literacy is knowing how, knowing how to read, literacy, numeracy. In this case, it's about equity, knowing how to, but having those dispositions. So how much training somebody tell me, how much training have you all had on this whole concept around education, equity, equity literacy? Yes, Ms. Bryant?
So I'm in Charles County, which is in Southern Maryland, and we actually have to take an equity course in order, it's a 3-hour course that's provided by the school system before we start the school year. So
Okay.
like it's literally mandatory, and it's through one of those 3 sheets where it goes through, so it goes into your personnel file.
Okay. Does anyone else have a lot of equity sessions and workshops?
I can add that, I've been in a number of arenas where we will partake in equity training, and it has proven to be beneficial for myself and for others. I will say, however, that the equity literacy part is typically not included, right? Because the individual training has to have their own consciousness of what that means, right? In order to even introduce it. And so that's a terminology that I'm familiar with just because of the nature of my work, but it's not a terminology I would expect others to be familiar with, unless they had someone like yourself who was already kind of conscious of it and then introduced it. Because I've not seen it in the curriculum of equity training in my experience in the arenas that I've been in.
Okay. Anyone else want to respond to equity, educational equity or equity literacy? Okay, and the last piece to this around Paul Gorski work is equity literate educators. And this is the one I think is really important. Equity literate educators recognize and draw upon the resiliency and other funds of knowledge accumulated by poor and students of color and reject deficit views that focus on, this is where the amen is, you all. Listen to this right here. This is worth tweeting. Accumulated by poor and students of color and reject deficit views that focus on fixing disenfranchised students rather than fixing the things that disenfranchise students. I said a word right there. That's some good stuff right there, Gorski. Listen to that. Equity literate educators recognize and draw upon the resiliency and other funds of knowledge accumulated by poor and students of color and reject deficit views that focus on fixing disenfranchised students rather than fixing the things that disenfranchise students. That's a lot of unpack and breakdown. So let's first start with funds of knowledge. Funds of knowledge is basically what students bring to school from their home, from their communities, and other reference groups. No student comes to school a blank slate. They all bring knowledge to school. And if you ever sit in the cafeteria and listen to them, they know a lot of stuff. Some stuff you don't want to hear, but they know it, right? So they have knowledge, but a lot of times, particularly with our poor students, we assume because they're poor that they don't bring knowledge to school, and they do. And so what happens is we get caught up in poverty. We approach it from a deficit orientation versus a difference orientation in that knowledge. And so when it comes to a deficit orientation, because they are poor, lack some resources at home and in the community, we approach it from a deficit that they do not have knowledge, a knowledge base. They do have a knowledge base. It may not be the content you're trying to teach them, but they have a knowledge base. And so what good educators do, they connect what students don't know to what they do know, which is their funds of knowledge. And so we want to approach it from a difference orientation versus a deficit orientation. A difference orientation is connecting with those things that they already know, prior knowledge, correct? And so the funds of knowledge is things they bring to school all the time. I live here in Lexington. I live not too far from middle school that is about 40% African-American, about 40% Latinx, and the rest white students, about 87% free and reduced lunch. And so in my neighborhood, there's a number of Latinx men who are doing construction in my neighborhood, right? And they bring their sons with them on the weekend. And Is there any math in construction? Okay.
Yes,
Exactly.
there's a lot of math in construction.
Exactly. So Diane's like, yeah, yeah. So these same young men on weekends who are doing construction with their fathers will go back to that middle school and can't do basic measurements or fractions because we don't tap into their funds of knowledge. They have math skills. We just don't tap into it because we approach it from a deficit view, deficit orientation versus a difference orientation. And because it's not everyday math or Singapore math, it is not good math. Well, the fact of the matter, it is. And we connect that to their experiences outside of school. And equity literate educators understand that part. And then the other piece is that students do not need to be fixed, okay? You know, a lot of times the inequities actually start outside of school, okay? But we can't fix everything outside of school, but the last thing we want it to be is we don't want to be complicit in increasing those inequities when they come to school, okay? So we don't want to fix students. We want to fix the things that are disenfranchising the students. Now, I said a lot in those three: educational equity, equity literacy, equity literate educators. So I'll give you all some time to think about that and process. Any thoughts on that, those concepts alone? What's going through your minds right now? I know that was a lot. Thoughts, comments?
I'm thinking back the first 6 years of my career. I'm an old guy. I worked in French Canada. I taught at McGill, McGill University, but half my students were French Canadians. I experienced this literacy issue mainly through language because a lot of the French Canadians that came to McGill were learning English at the same time they were trying to learn course content. And it's sort of a trial by fire, but I learned to teach with a different language than I did if I had a US audience of all English speaking students. I don't know if that's the same thing, but I realize now that the problem wasn't in fixing the students. The problem was in teaching in a way that they could comprehend it and understand it, even though English was their second language.
Okay. Thank you. You know, if there's an achievement gap, there could be a practice gap or an expectation gap. And so we always, when we look at disparities between groups of students, we always should look at our practice and the people first, not the pupil. And a lot of times when there's disparities, we look at the students instead of looking at our practice. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, I
Let's
have
go
some. First, I'm a brand new teacher this year, so I retired from my other job, and this is my first year teaching school. But I do want to address the fact that I have a grandson, and he's in an advanced reading class, relay, they call it relay, in the 8th grade. And he says, "Grandma, why do my teachers talk down to me?" Well, like, I don't understand what they're talking about. So to me, that falls into that category. They're assuming certain things because they might be Black and before he came to middle school, he was in maybe a class where they may have been co-taught or something like that. But they found out when he took a test that he scored second in the whole school in reading. And so then from that point on, they started putting him in accelerated classes and stuff, but they still talk to him like he doesn't understand.
Well, we talked about that last week also, right? About perceptions.
Mhm.
You know, we make 11 decisions or assumptions about someone within 7 seconds. And so if you've been taught or you heard this over and over again, that poor students can't do this, or students of color can't do this, or ELL students can't do this. At some point in time, that you internalize that, it's going to come out in your practice. And you create this self-fulfilling prophecy and they don't do well, China says China can't do it. And then you don't challenge China, you don't and give her access to rigor. And then when we take the district state assessment and she's a novice and you say, well, see, I told you so, China couldn't do it. Well, China couldn't do it because you didn't give her an opportunity to do it. That's why. And that's all about access and expectations. And part of that is part of your bias where it's unconscious that you're not aware you're doing it. And, sometimes, your grandson may say, you know what, why do y'all think I can't do this? I'm surprised he hasn't said it yet, and, because, me, when I was in middle school, I'd probably said it. What do you mean, That's just how I roll sometimes. All right. Thank you, Robin. And that's just a picture of about equity and people's like, why are you complaining? We got the same distance, right? We got the same distance to the finish line, but look at the barriers that some people have and others don't. So I like this. What do y'all think I mean by this? Equity is the process, equality is the outcome. Y'all know that's dope, right? Go ahead and tweet it if you want to. Equity is the process, equality is the outcome. What do I mean by that? And a lot of you are high school folks. Think about the outcome. Equity is the process, equality is the outcome. What does that mean to you?
To me, that means if we gave everybody what they needed, then they would all be on a level playing field.
Exactly. If they go through all right, so I have on the screen right now, on the small screen, I have Kelly and Robin. So if Kelly and Robin starts preschool, and I give Robin everything she needs from preschool to 12th grade, and she has some skin in the game, then she'll be prepared to do a number of things, right? What I call the 4 E's: enrollment, employment, enlistment, or entrepreneurship. Okay. But I'll give Kelly the same thing, all this, for all the other students, give her the exact same thing, the instruction, things like that. Now the outcomes should be the same, but how they get there should be different, right? The product is only good as the process. So Kelly will not necessarily be prepared as well as you are because I didn't meet her individual needs and I met your individual needs. That's what we mean by equity is the process, equality is the outcome. Now you see how dope that is, China? Exactly. So that's a way to think about the.
Don't be surprised if I tag you on Twitter or Facebook. Shout you out.
That's all right. That's what good educators do, right? We beg, borrow, and steal. That's what educators do. Exactly. That's what we do. As long as it's about children, that's all that matters. And so it's really about the process. And so, what kind of process are we taking Terry through? Her 13 years of education is going to be critical when it's time to walk across the stage and what Terry can do. If Terry is limited to only going into employment, that may be part of that, her issue, but also been part of her educational process she went through. But she should be able to do all the 4 E's. She should have a number of options when she finishes. And so that's what we mean by that. All right, so let's shift to how culture plays a role in this whole educational thing. So let's talk about cultural influences in schools. And I'm not going to go through this definition. You all know what culture means. Norms, beliefs, values, mores, your religion, your language, geographical location, ethnicity, all that's part of your culture that's passed from one generation to another. That's what we mean by culture. So moving forward, that's one definition of culture. I'm sure you all have many more, but I'm not going to read that for you all. So knowing that this is the definition of culture, how is culture like an iceberg? I'm gonna start doing some, instead of volunteering, I'm gonna do some voluntold. Let's see what Dean, how is culture like an iceberg?
Well, when you look at somebody, you see just the top 10% or, whatever. And like an iceberg, the rest of that culture and what makes that person who they are is everything underneath that we're not seeing. That actually is the basis for that person and keeps that person upright.
Okay, exactly. So as Dean said, only about 8 to 10% of the iceberg is above water, right? So the rest of it is underneath. And so a lot of times when we're dealing with families and students, um, you know, imagine you're trying to recruit more, let's say recruit more girls and more students of color into ag. And so you got this whole marketing thing, but the marketing thing is not connecting to the population, the clientele you're trying to reach, right? And so you can't really know what marketing strategies you use if you don't know the people you're trying to actually reach out to. And so sometimes you have to make it culturally relevant to those people to want to get into ag. As the school my son attended, it's 90%, it's a all boys school, it's 90%, now about 85% African American and about 14% Latinx young men, and then the 1% white males. And so they have about 40 kids um, in their ag program, you know, and you don't see that many African American males, you know, in FFA in one particular school. The other school has that many African American males in that school. So, but the way they approached it, the University of Kentucky, they made it make sense to those young men because the young men had that perception that the ag was plows and cows, right? And so they didn't understand all the science and STEM and stuff that's part of ag also. So how they approached it. So a lot of times we have to go beyond the surface because usually we think about culture, we think about food, dress, music, drama, dance, language, celebrations. Is what I call heroes and holidays, right? But the heroes and holidays don't get to the deep culture that is critical to building relationships with students, understand their families. Things like funds of knowledge, assumptions, ethnicity, their background, their beliefs, social interaction, proxemics, perceptions, conversation patterns. Those are things that are critical to connecting with students, critical to discipline, teaching. For example, conversation patterns. Okay, so let's say I'm gonna use Kyle for example. I don't want to use Kyle used you last week. I'm gonna leave you alone in a second. It probably won't be till next week, but I'm gonna leave you alone. But anyway, let's say Kyle is a ninth grader, okay, and he stays with his grandmother, and their conversation patterns or discourse patterns are very explicit, meaning that when she says, Kyle, I want go to the store. Kyle, do your homework. Kyle, get off the game. Get off Xbox. He knows exactly what his grandmother's saying. And then because we don't understand the conversation patterns because it's deep culture, he comes to school. He walks in Dean's class 10 minutes late. And Dean says implicitly, not explicitly, implicitly, Kyle, would you like to take a seat? Kyle says, no. Referral, insubordination. Sends him down to the principal's office. Well, Principal Diane is not, she's downtown looking at test scores. While Kyle's sitting in the office missing what? Instructional time, right? Or Kyle comes in the classroom 10 minutes late, and the teacher says, Dean says, Kyle, would you like to take a seat? He picks up the chair. Where do you want me to take it? Students bust out laughing. Disruption of class. Sends him down to the principal's office. Because Kyle is used to getting explicit conversations and discourse with his grandmother. And so when the person goes to a home visit, they bring the intel back to Dean and says, look, when you deal with Kyle, you need to be very fair and firm and explicit. That's how you communicate with this young man. And that's how he responds to it. But you would never know staying at the tip of the iceberg. You got to figure out either from your own or get other intel from social workers or whatever who does home visits to get that deep culture. So he won't be going in and out of class. So when test scores come back, it looks like Kyle can't learn and Dean can't teach. It's neither. He can teach and he can learn, but he missed hours of instructional time because we didn't understand the deep culture and the communication patterns, the discourse patterns from Kyle and his grandparents. Does that make sense? So it could be conversation patterns, it could be proxemics, depending on where you are. If you're in a rural part of Maryland, you know, your social proxemics may be a little closer than if you're in Baltimore, right? You know, so the proxemics could be cultural bound. How you communicate be cultural bound. Geographical location, all that is tied back to the culture. let me show you another way to look at it. See, the tip part of it is the part that Dean was talking about. That's the 8 to 10%. But they bring all this other stuff below to school also. And a lot of times we're not aware of that. And sometimes we kick off a trigger because we're not aware of that deep culture. So let's say that, let me pick on Lisa. So let's say, Lisa, have you ever been to like Walmart or B-Dubs, my favorite spot, or some other place, and when your students walk in, they lose their minds because they see you? Miss Lisa, what's going on? Did that ever happen to you? All the time. You know why they do that? Because
they love me.
Well, that's the other reason. You know, that's a given.
They love me. That's what it is.
Yeah. So they see you in a different context. They never see you because, you know, so students sometimes believe that teachers live in the basement of the school and they come up Monday morning and just start teaching because they never see you in a different context. So when they see you out shopping or, you know, watching a game and beat, you know, Buffalo Wild Wings, they're like, oh my God, it's Miss Lisa, what's she doing here? You're like, it's 50-cent wing night. What do you think I'm doing here? So sometimes you need to share your deep culture also to strengthen that relationship. Because, you know, they're always giving, but we're not giving. So understanding that culture is really important. All right. When someone with the authority of an educator describes the world, you're not in it. There's a moment of psychic disequilibrium as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. When someone with the authority of an educator describes the world and you're not in it, there's a moment of psychic disequilibrium as if you looked into a mirror and saw nothing. What is that saying to you all? What's that saying to you all?
Without a frame of reference, you don't have an anchor.
Okay. All right. I like that. What else?
This is Nicole. I'll share that it's saying that that's unnerving. It's not validating. And therefore, it can actually create a question of where do I fit? And all those things can happen with someone not even realizing that being left out is creating that.
Now, Nicole said one word, all that was good, but she said one word that really should stand out: validating. And when we get down to cultural responsiveness, part of cultural responsive teaching is validating people's experiences. And then so someone else, if I go on, you know, Nicole's got me hyped up now. I'm getting lathered like LeBron. I don't want to go there yet. Somebody else talked to me about this quote. What else? Good. I like that, Nicole.
Suzanne said validation, and Lisa put in the chat box, be me, see me.
Okay. Be me, see me. If a student is attending school and they get to about the 10th grade and they haven't seen themselves in the curriculum, their instruction, the artifacts on the walls and in the building, you know, never looks like them, what message are we sending them? And at some point in time, they're going to say, well, apparently this school thing is not for me. And they leave school prematurely in about the 9th or 10th grade, and they leave physically about their 11th grade year because they don't see themselves. It's hard to be what you don't see, right?
Suzanne shared in the chat box, I'm not a teacher, but gosh, this drives home what an enormous amount of power teachers have over young minds. And Kim shares, we in our words have a huge impact on how kids feel about themselves. And Pat shared, if they can't relate, they check out.
Life and death is in the power of the tongue, right? What we say has a lot of meaning and have a lot of power. So I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna ask Terry to look through the responses to the question that I had about culturally responsive instructional strategies. And I asked that question for the entire staff because if I had just said, do you, Dean would answer the question based on his classroom, and Nicole would answer the question in her classroom in China. But I wanted you to think about your entire school because we know everyone there's someone in the school that's using culturally responsive teaching practice. We know that in almost every school, but collectively, are we doing it? And that's what the question's about, our staff. So what some of the responses? I saw a lot of B's in there, which means agree.
Right. Most of them agree. There were 2 disagrees, and the rest of them all agreed with the statement. And we
Okay. And so when you all were thinking agree, go ahead. I'm sorry, Terry.
We had 18 responses to that question as people came in. 16 B's, 2 C's.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you all questions. This is a rhetorical question. Would you respond it differently if it was anonymous? Now you can answer that if you want to, but so if I came to your school, this is what this is saying. If I came to visit, I'm coming to Maryland, so y'all must get ready. And if I came to your school and did some walkthroughs and classroom observations, I would see culturally responsive strategies in the majority of the classrooms. That's what that means, right? If you agree or strongly agree, I would see the majority of culturally responsive practices in the classroom. So would you still answer the same way?
No.
I see Robin shaking her head. So Robin, what'd you say? Did you say B or A or what'd you say?
I said B.
Okay, so you want to put that down to C or a B minus?
I'll take it to a C.
Take it to a C. So remember I was talking about collectively. I didn't say Robin wasn't doing it. I said collectively, our staff. Our staff.
But you also mentioned like in the hallways, in the rooms, is it part of the atmosphere? And
well,
so,
I didn't go that far. I just said, instructional practices in the school. So mostly the classroom.
but that's what it means to me though.
Yeah.
If they're there and they're engaged and I'm noticing them, then it's going to be displayed throughout the school.
Mm-hmm. Well, I was been nice. I just said the classroom. I didn't go school wide, like you said. The books in the library and all those things. So, would anyone change?
What about some of the young people, our state officers? How do you feel from your school experiences?
Well, I'd love to hear that.
One or two of you want to share? They're looking at me like, don't put me on the spot, Mrs. J. I will call on you.
So I think, hello?
Go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think for me, in my previous life working in schools, I would change my answer to no. If the answer was, is the entire school, is everyone, the person across the hall, committed to equity in schools, I would have to say I disagree. But I think in my state role now, I would keep my answer of agree, because part of our mission is to ensure that there is equity in almost everything that we're doing at the state level, and modeling that priority. But no, I would change my answer if I had to reflect on my previous life.
Okay. Thanks.
Yeah, I would second what Anders just said. He thinking right in line with what I was thinking. If I was actually in a classroom or in a school, based on my previous experiences, I would definitely change my answer. But like Anders, I'm also at the state level. And I feel like I'm going to say absolutely no, I won't change my answer. But that answer, not saying that in a sense is kind of biased, because my position is the equity and civil rights compliance specialist at the State Department, right? So my position was redeveloped and restructured, and they brought me in specifically for my division and really to help others throughout the agency make sure that we're compliant with equity. So by default of my position, I'm like, of course, because that's my job, make sure that across the board in my division, that we're keeping, apprised and really making sure that we're putting into practice a lot of equitable strategies. And then outside of our division, I find myself partnering with other divisions at the agency to do the very same thing. So what Anders said, I did all of that.
Okay. Now, Terry,
I'm sorry.
You go ahead, Nicole.
So I was going to say, my name is Nicole, and I want to say thank you so much. I don't know exactly, China, if you're the one who sponsored this, but I am in Caroline, and I received this information from our ag teacher. And I definitely hopped on because part of my supervisory role in the district is doing our equity work. So when we see this extrapolating out from our departments from MSDE, I think it is wonderful, which is why I like jumping on. And I wasn't on in the first few minutes, but I would definitely share from looking through our district. I know that there are pockets, and we are working to grow our pockets so that one day I can answer that pretty much all classrooms are culturally responsive. But I would definitely, if I'd seen that question first, had to have said, probably no. I think that might be what your B is, because it's hit or miss, and we definitely want it to be more.
Yeah, and Nicole, I call those pockets islands of excellence.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, and we want that permeated throughout the district. Now, state, what we call state, what are they called, Terry?
State FFA officers.
Yeah, state officers. I haven't forgotten. So I would love to hear from our state officers to respond.
I'll go ahead and give an answer. So my name's Cassie Bell. I'm serving as Maryland FFA state president. I kind of took it as like the staff being us as state officers, since we're not employees of a school system. We've only ever really attended school. We like to view ourselves as pretty inclusive and trying to keep things diverse, making this a home for everyone. And I don't think I would change my answer. I selected B, that I agreed. As for a state officer team, I don't think I would change my answer. And this training is only helping to better equip us with those skills to, promote our diversity, equity, and inclusion, and making sure we're always using inclusive language, the you statements, the us statements, rather than me and I statements.
All right, thank you, Cassie.
Answer.
All right, thank you. Anyone else before we move on? And I would like, maybe in your office, in your classroom, wherever, just, put that up on the wall somewhere so every now and then we may forget. Put that quote for Adrian Rich to remind us that we want to be inclusive and respond to the experiences students bring to the classroom. All right, good stuff, you all. Cultural clashes. So cultural clashes are some behaviors that students bring to school that clash with school policies and expectations. I don't like to say school rules because rules are like for jails and prisons. Schools have expectations, but if we say rules, that's fine. So what are some cultural clashes that you see that may happen where students bring certain behaviors to school and then they clash with school policy or school expectations? And how do you reconcile those clashes? I don't know, Cassie's got a sneaky smile on her face. I don't know what that means. What are some cultural clashes? I give you like dress, right? Language could be a cultural clash.
Hair or lack thereof.
Okay, could be a cultural clash. What else? Tone could be a cultural clash.
Religious.
How do you say it again?
Religious beliefs and
Religious
understanding.
beliefs.
I had a number of students that were Seventh-day Adventists, so they worshiped on Saturdays. So trying to be mindful not to plan activities on Saturdays and so that they could participate.
Okay. Winter break versus Christmas break. Everyone doesn't celebrate Christmas, right? So, the reason why I put this in here and want to go deep on is because a lot of these cultural clashes turn into discipline issues just because of cultural incongruence and cultural mismatch. And so students bring who they are. The key thing is that regardless how you reconcile those cultural incongruences or mismatches, that you never dismiss or disrespect a student's culture or their families. And so in other words, if I'm bringing a certain behavior in that's actually problematic in the classroom, where I may be talking over someone or talking at the same time or whatever, and that's my family. I have a big family. We talk over each other. We all talk at the same time. And if you get that from 5, 6 years old and you go to school and you don't really know how to do school yet, and you're doing that, well, the way a teacher approaches that is critical, because if you say that's wrong, quit doing that, well, you just told 10 other people back at their house that there's something wrong with how they communicate, right? So your approach is critical. And, it could be appropriate, says this is not appropriate behavior at this particular time, but, the situation behavior You know, we all do it, right? We all do it. And see, Cassie, you on here with all these folks who've been educated, they are professional. Oh, they do things that they know they can't do on that three-day weekend. They can't do at school. You know, it's situational behavior. It's not appropriate at school. So we teach students behavior expectations that we want. You never heard this before. Get out of my class until you learn algebra. You never heard anyone say that, but you've heard this out of my class till you learn how to behave. Any discipline issues and things of that nature. The cultural clash. Cultural compatibility. Does anyone want to just share their thoughts about what you already know about move from Maryland and still be an effective educator and a consultant at the State Department in Eastern Kentucky as she is in Maryland? Because she's been effective in a different cultural context. Because Appalachian culture in Eastern Kentucky is just a little bit different in Maryland. I'm just put it out there, okay? So she's going to a different cultural environment, but she's still effective. So she's using her skills and knowledge base of what she knows about the students in Eastern Kentucky to be effective with them. That's cultural competence around skills and knowledge. So let's look at the difference between humility. And I think we need to move from cultural competence to cultural humility and to see if you understand why.
Can I ask a question first?
Sure. Mm-hmm.
As you go through these things, I'm picturing myself in front of a classroom of students where
Mm-hmm.
there are 3 or 4 cultures represented.
Mm-hmm.
How do I apply all those things? It's almost like speaking to people who know 4 different languages, and you can't talk to the whole class. You have to talk to the whole class one way. I certainly understand how you apply these things on one-on-one interactions, but with a class full of students from different cultural backgrounds, how do you make that work?
Well,
And
you
that's
also
sort of a rhetorical question. I don't know that there's an easy answer to it.
There's not an easy answer, but there's an answer to it. And one thing is that when you give an assignments and things like that, let students do their own personal narratives or build an assignment where they can bring their own cultural experiences into that assignment. And what you're doing is learning, right, about who they are, and also why they're involved in the construction of new knowledge. So you can also build those things into, you're not gonna be able to do that every day in the classroom, you know what I'm saying, Tom? Yep. Every single day, but you can provide opportunities where you can connect it and they can share who they are and their experiences. And it goes back to what Nicole was saying. The fact that you're doing that, you're validating their experiences and their culture, okay? And the more they share like that, what's gonna happen with you? The more content and experience you're gonna learn about them. That makes sense?
Yep.
Yeah, but understand though, if you're in a school district, like in Lexington, we have 110 different languages spoken in our school district. We know that every single day, you're not gonna be able to connect to every, Somalian kid and this kid from here and things like that. But as many opportunities you can to give them opportunities to share through the assignments, okay? Then not only are they learning the content that you're providing, but you're also getting content from them, which you're building your repertoire to deal with different groups of people. And you can take some of that information that they're sharing, and when you go outside the school and you go in their neighborhoods and communities, you can be a little more responsive to their families and things of that nature.
Dr. Cleveland,
Yes.
Kelsey shared that high leverage practices are tools that help you build your cultural competency in the classroom too. And she shared a link in the chat to highleveragepractices.org.
All right, thank you. Cultural humility is the process of self-evaluation that focuses on how our culture influences our perceptions of other communities and the impact that it has on our ability to participate in successful cultural exchanges. Basically, cultural humility is about you seeing the person that you're working with, whether it's a student or a client, they're the expert of their culture, not you. And the other different piece about cultural humility versus cultural competence, cultural humility expects you to always do some kind of self-awareness of your biases and some kind of self-reflection about you getting to know and understand different groups of people. Cultural competence doesn't necessarily require you to ask you to do that, looking at your own biases and doing some self-awareness of yourself. Culture, that's why I like moving from cultural competence to humility. And here's a way to really look at that. And cultural competency in an education definition, cultural competency is effective integration of knowledge about students' backgrounds into instructional planning and strategies, resulting in learning of curricular concepts at high levels. And you can't really do that unless you start to know your students. But here's the way to look at it. Humility, okay, student is the expert about their own culture. Competency, teacher is the expert. And one is a mindset and one is a skill set. And so the teacher is looking at skills and knowledge and things like that. And since they acquired those skills and knowledge, they may see they're the expert in working with different groups of students. The person that understands cultural humility sees that the student is the expert of their own culture and I'm learning from them, okay? I'm learning from the student or the client or the families, where cultural competency that you build in knowledge and skills, now you know you're the expert about different groups of people and things of that nature. Okay, I want to get to this, so I definitely want to watch this. This is a video called "The Danger of a Single Story." And it's basically about a lady. She's talking about her experiences about perceptions, and she was when she going to the States to go to college, and how people perceived her because she was from Nigeria. We're gonna watch the video, and then we're gonna go out in our breakout rooms and have a conversation about the video. All right, here we go. And somebody give me the thumbs up to make sure you can hear it.
I'm a storyteller, and I would like to tell you a few personal stories about what I like to call the danger of the single story. I grew up on a university campus in eastern Nigeria. My mother says that I started reading at the age of 2, although I think 4 is probably close to the truth. So I was an early reader, and what I read were British and American children's books. I was also an early writer. And when I began to write at about the age of 7, stories in pencil with crayon illustrations that my poor mother was obligated to read, I wrote exactly the kinds of stories I was reading. All my characters were white and blue-eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples. And they talked a lot about the weather, how lovely it was that the sun had come out. Now, this despite the fact that I lived in Nigeria. I had never been outside Nigeria. We didn't have snow. We ate mangoes. And we never talked about the weather because there was no need to. My characters also drank a lot of ginger beer because the characters in the British books I read drank ginger beer. Never mind that I had no idea what ginger beer was. And for many years afterwards, I would have a desperate desire to taste ginger beer. But that is another story. What this demonstrates, I think, is how impressionable and vulnerable we are in the face of a story, particularly as children. Because all I had read were books in which characters were foreign, I had become convinced that books, by their very nature, had to have foreigners in them and had to be about things with which I could not personally identify. Now, things changed when I discovered African books. There weren't many of them available, and they weren't quite as easy to find as the foreign books, but because of writers like Chinua Achebe and Kamara Laye, I went through a mental shift in my perception of literature. I realized that people like me, girls with skin the color of chocolate, whose kinky hair could not form ponytails, could also exist in literature. I started to write about things I recognized. Now, I loved those American and British books I read. They stirred my imagination. They opened up new worlds for me. But the unintended consequence was that I did not know that people like me could exist in literature. So what the discovery of African writers did for me was this. It saved me from having a single story of what books are. I come from a conventional middle-class Nigerian family. My father was a professor. My mother was an administrator. And so we had, as was the norm, live-in domestic help who would often come from nearby rural villages. So the year I turned 8, we got a new houseboy. His name was Fide. The only thing my mother told us about him was that his family was very poor. My mother sent yams and rice and our old clothes to his family. And when I didn't finish my dinner, my mother would say, "Finish your food. Don't you know people like Fide's family have nothing?" So I felt enormous pity for Fide's family. Then one Saturday, we went to his village to visit. And his mother showed us a beautifully patterned basket made of dyed raffia that his brother had made. I was startled. It had not occurred to me that anybody in his family could actually make something. All I had heard about them was how poor they were, so that it had become impossible for me to see them as anything else but poor. Their poverty was my single story of them. Years later, I thought about this when I left Nigeria to go to university in the United States. I was 19. My American roommate was shocked by me. She asked where I had learned to speak English so well and was confused when I said that Nigeria happened to have English as its official language. She asked if she could listen to what she called my tribal music and was consequently very disappointed when I produced my tape of Mariah Carey. She assumed that I did not know how to use a stove. What struck me was this: she had felt sorry for me even before she saw me. Her default position toward me as an African was a kind of patronizing, well-meaning pity. My roommate had a single story of Africa, a single story of catastrophe. In this single story, there was no possibility of Africans being similar to her in any way, no possibility of feelings more complex than pity, no possibility of a connection as human equals. I must say that before I went to the US, I didn't consciously identify as African. But in the US, whenever Africa came up, people turned to me, never mind that I knew nothing about places like Namibia. But I did come to embrace this new identity, and in many ways, I think of myself now as African, although I still get quite irritable when Africa is referred to as a country, the most recent example being my otherwise wonderful flight from Lagos 2 days ago, in which there was an announcement on the Virgin flight about their charity walk in India, Africa, and other countries. So after I had spent some years in the US as an African, I began to understand my roommate's response to me. If I had not grown up in Nigeria, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images, I too would think that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves, and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I would see Africans in the same way that I, as a child, had seen Fide's family. This single story of Africa ultimately comes, I think, from Western literature. Now, here's a quote from the writing of a London merchant called John Locke, who sailed to West Africa in 1561 and kept a fascinating account of his voyage. After referring to the Black Africans as beasts who have no houses, he writes, "They are also people without heads, having their mouths and eyes in their breasts." Now, I've laughed every time I've read this, and one must admire the imagination of John Locke. But what is important about his writing is that it represents the beginning of a tradition of telling African stories in the West, a tradition of sub-Saharan Africa as a place of negatives, of difference, of darkness, of people who, in the words of the wonderful poet Rudyard Kipling, are half devil, half child. And so I began to realize that my American roommate must have, throughout her life, seen and heard different versions of this single story. As had a professor who once told me that my novel was not authentically African. Now, I was quite willing to contend that there were a number of things wrong with the novel, that it had failed in a number of places, but I had not quite imagined that it had failed at achieving something called African authenticity. In fact, I did not know what African authenticity was. The professor told me that my characters were too much like him, an educated and middle-class man. My characters drove cars. They were not starving. Therefore, they were not authentically African. But I must quickly add that I too am just as guilty on the question of the single story. A few years ago, I visited Mexico from the US. The political climate in the US at the time was tense, and there were debates going on about immigration. And as often happens in America, immigration became synonymous with Mexicans. There were endless stories of Mexicans as people who were fleecing the healthcare system, sneaking across the border, being arrested at the border, that sort of thing. I remember walking around on my first day in Guadalajara, watching the people going to work, rolling up tortillas in the marketplace, smoking, laughing. I remember first feeling slight surprise, and then I was overwhelmed with shame. I realized that I had been so immersed in the media coverage of Mexicans that they had become one thing in my mind, the abject immigrant. I had bought into the single story of Mexicans, and I could not have been more ashamed of myself. So that is how to create a single story. Show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that is what they become.
Okay, so Terry's going to send you into your breakout rooms, and I just want you a couple of things. You can talk about whatever you want to talk about. Here's a couple of prompts, though. Discuss the concept of the single story that she talked about. How can the single story influence teacher expectations? So whenever you're ready, Terry, we can send them off, and I may peep in a couple of the rooms.
All righty, we will do that. And here we go. There'll be 4 in a room. There you go. They're all in their breakout rooms.
Experience in mass media, I guess. So it was pretty cool. But yeah, I catch myself doing that a lot. And then you rethink it when you're suddenly exposed to something that you're not used to. So
I think I kind of like we talked a little bit last week about the, you hear so-and-so's little sister, so-and-so's little brother, and oh, you're the last of whoever. So it's kind of, you prejudge, even though you don't necessarily realize you do, when you're getting new students each semester, and just from hearing other teachers and hearing other kids talk.
yeah, for sure. What were you gonna say, Morgan?
I was going to say, I think I can relate to what you were saying about how you went to Japan. I went to the Bahamas, and, you have the image in your head of like, oh, like blue water, stuff like that. When I saw like the different part of town, and it was like, it was kind of emotional. You know what I mean? Like, it's not how everybody pictures it to be, like a happy place. I mean, that's with any place, I feel like. And it was definitely really eye-opening, I could say.
Yeah, for sure. Definitely.
I think I don't know. I just keep meditating on this word singular. Or single rather, and I'm just glad that word was in there. It just implies that there are multiple stories. I mean, I know it's kind of a yeah, but to keep the context of creating I think that was the word, a single narrative, a single story.
Yeah, that is.
I think quietly, she's really making an implication that there are multiple stories. It's not just another story, I guess is my point. That in my interpretation of singular, it's not that it's binary, it's not clearly a Western author narrative of Nigeria, let's say, is going to be, as she has illustrated, depending on the year, right, depending on the century, it's going to be erroneous. But I think the other twist to that is to say that even within Nigeria, there are multiple stories. So it's not just this, I don't feel, it's not just this idea of, okay, well, let's get the non-Western story. It's let's also appreciate the multiple stories that are non-Western, or multiple stories that are Nigerian based. You see what I'm saying?
Right. I mean, like, you go as an American to any country and they have this image of what Americans are, and then they meet you and you're like, wait a second, you're not like all of them at all. And you're like, no, we're not all the same. Or you ever just sit there and you're like watching a plane go by in the sky. There's like, I don't know, 100 people on that plane. Each person's on that plane for a different reason. They all have their own story. And like, you sit there and think about any time you've been on a plane and think, oh, that's why they're on a plane. I'm going, to the Bahamas or on vacation or whatever. But some of them that might be like a normal work thing for them once a week to go on a plane, or they're going to see their family or whatever. So it's kind of like, it doesn't have to be just even culture. It could be just daily stories of yourself and others and what you do. So, and trying to keep that in mind when you're in the classroom, that there's 30 kids in your classroom and each one has a different story that they're like following. So,
right. And I guess to also then give them, to continue with your example, to give them the rights of authorship, right?
Right.
To give them the platform to be the authors of their own story. I guess that's the humility piece, right? I guess that's the humility piece.
I even think about it, even in this day and age, when you say the word agriculture or farmer, what do they think of? The guy in the bib overalls. There's still a lot of questions. You're an agriculture teacher and you're female, or you have a role, or the student is going to an ag class. Well, why are you doing that? Do you want to farm? There's a lot of assumptions about just the desires that kids have and the careers they want to follow, and how that relates to others outside of maybe your classroom when the kids go out the door.
Interesting. It's interesting with that being said, Terry, because when I started teaching, 25 years ago, it was ag science plants and ag science animals, and then they changed it to just agriculture science. Well, then we changed it 4 or 5 years ago. This is within Frederick County, but changed it to kind of get away from that, change it to introduction to agriculture science and technology. And now we're contemplating changing it to something else to still get away from the stigma and to incorporate more kids. So it's the same thing, whether it's this subject or whether it's, people in general. You still have that thought process of what you're thinking and perceptions.
I always think of like how we went through all that training, Ms. Shank, and it's like you have to learn how to be your authentic self and whatever. But we never really talked about, or maybe we did kind of with like under all those layers, how to keep letting other people be their own authentic self. Like that's their singular story, but letting them be authentic in their own way and share that is really important. So, because you want to break the stigma so you can show that there's more to this than what meets the eye. But then you also have students who meet that stigma and they're proud of it. Like, I'm in ag because my goal is to own a farm, and it might not be 100% of the kids, but there's still some in there that is their passion. So I want to say break the stigma, but at the same time I hesitate to say that because I know I have 5 kids in my classroom that are like, yeah, I'm planning on taking over the farm in the future, or like I want to buy my own land out in the Midwest and whatever. And I'm like, dude, you go for that, because I do not want to do that ever. So,
but I think it's important for us as a leadership team, and I know Morgan is one of our student leaders, that we can look at the kids when we do chapter visits and when we do interact with them in the conferences and things, that we realize their responses are what they are feeling and what they're seeing and what they're perceiving, and not try to make it what we think it should be that they see or feel. Or don't you feel that way, Morgan, that we're really working hard to try to meet the kids where they are and really embrace those differences?
I think so. I mean, I guess I can start to see it now more than ever since it's virtual. You can see how different a lot of people are, and all throughout the state, everybody, like Kelsey said, has their own story, and you can kind of start to see that through everybody. And I like that. I like to be able to see that, we're all different. But yeah, I agree with Ms. Shank.
And
I
I
think
put
that
in
was
the
even
chat
key, Morgan
box.
just saying.
Yeah, go ahead,
Sorry.
Pat.
I said, I think what Morgan just said, it was even kind of key, all unique, even throughout the state. What
Yes.
agriculture kids within Frederick County are so different than might be, lower Eastern Shore as opposed to Western Maryland, and not just ag students, but all students, all people. So kind of, again, their culture.
Right. And some of that, that we talked about last week with the implicit bias, as we look at across the state and our differences, and you look at Western Maryland and the number of schools we have that are 99.9% Caucasian or 100% Caucasian within counties, and, where it's relevant to where the housing is for students, and those differences come into play then too. Anders, were you going to share something else? Another thought?
Well, I another thought that just might be a tad unrelated, so just stop me if it goes too far down the rabbit hole. I guess there was two things. One, the question of, does naming yourself then increase the opportunity to diversify students who have access to the agricultural sciences, right? So Pat, you had mentioned that, you've gone through a lot of iterations, and even now, I guess there's a conversation afoot about, renaming what our program is. And does the renaming or the rebranding of in this case, the agricultural technology program, or anything for that matter, do you rebrand yourself with the idea of trying to be more accessible to a more diverse student body? That was my first comment, or my first question. And then, of course, what's related to that is the power of being able to name yourself, right? Not everybody's able to kind of name themselves. And I think the other part of that was the second thought, Teresa, to what you had just mentioned, was, how does the agricultural technology program look itself in terms of its curriculum that allows students of different cultures to see themselves in agricultural sciences? Is the curriculum itself diverse? Can students see themselves? Can a person that looks like me, whatever I may look like to you, can a person like me see myself in that curriculum and therefore be attracted to that field? Because I'm actually I actually can see myself and my family, my history. I'm connected to that, I guess, is my point. Whereas right now, you're right, maybe there is that stigma of, well, that's farm people and rural, and that has nothing to do with me. I'm from the city and urban, but there is something, I work with Baltimore City, and there's still a lot of agricultural programs, at least in the schools that I worked with, that are still in the city. But those are my two thoughts, and really they're not really questions, they were just thoughts.
Well, one thing, it's kind of interesting. My co-worker at school, Kelsey and Terry, you both, Mr. Hawthorne is who I'm talking about. And so we both teach he teaches engines and mechanics. I teach the animal classes, and we both teach horticulture. So probably 6 or 7 years ago, he had some horticulture students who, a couple of those girls were cheerleaders. And he was trying to convince some of them to take engines and mechanics classes and the practicality of doing it. So it ends up the following year, there was like half a dozen of those girls, and they were still cheerleaders, that took his engines class. And so by doing that, like he had a bunch of John Deere green toolboxes. So he let them paint them pink. And so it was kind of neat. So we talked about then of, this is great because it does show these are real life, things. So other students can kind of see that, oh, it's a whole different brand. It's not just your farm boys taking this class. It's a whole different avenue of students taking it. So kind of along the same lines. It's, different, but the same.
Like allowing them to express themselves in that typically male dominated classroom, which is really important. Yeah.
Cool.
That was like the very first comment they made when they hired me on, because now I'm teaching ag mechanics. They're like, great, you'll bring in a whole new body of people. And I'm like, yay. So it'll be fun. We'll add the pink toolboxes too, maybe.
How much time we have, Terry?
About total about 15 minutes till 7 o'clock, about 2 minutes into breakouts, or a minute. If you want to give them a minute warning, I can give them a warning.
Okay, yeah.